He wanted peace after war. So he bought a forgotten cabin deep in the Oregon woods, a place where silence could finally drown out the echoes of the battlefield. But on his first night, his dog, Rex, started growling at the floorboards. And that's when Jim realized some things buried in the dark were never meant to stay hidden. The gravel crunched under the worn tires of Jim Walker's old Ford truck as it crawled up the narrow forest road. The Oregon woods stretched endlessly on both sides, pines swaying under the cool autumn breeze. Beside him, Rex, his German shepherd, sat upright, alert, watching the trees blur by. For the first time in years, Jim felt a faint calmness. After 2 decades in the Marines, after the noise, dust, and chaos of war, silence was all he wanted. He spotted the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the hills, a small, leaning structure made of dark, weathered logs. A "for sale" sign hung loosely from a nail, the price hand-painted, $500. It wasn't much to look at, but Jim didn't need much. He wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for quiet. When he stepped out of the truck, the air was cold and earthy. The cabin creaked under the weight of the wind, but it stood firm, like something that had seen 100 winters and still refused to fall. Rex sniffed around, tail low but curious, his paws leaving small prints on the damp soil. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of pine resin. There was a stone fireplace, a broken rocking chair, and a wooden table with one leg shorter than the rest. The floor groaned beneath Jim's boots. "Home sweet home," he muttered, almost to himself. Rex gave a soft whine, as if unsure whether to agree. That night, Jim lit a small fire. The flames painted the cabin walls in warm orange light, flickering over the rifle mounted above the fireplace, the only piece of his past he hadn't been able to let go of. He poured himself a cup of instant coffee, leaned back in the chair, and listened to the forest outside. The wind whispered through the trees, and for a moment everything felt still. Then Rex lifted his head. His ears pricked, body stiff. Jim frowned. "What is it, boy?" The dog stared at the far corner near the fireplace, eyes narrowing. Jim followed his gaze, but there was nothing, just shadows and old wood. He gave a soft laugh, more to shake off the unease than because anything was funny. "Relax, Rex. It's just the house settling." But Rex didn't relax. He stood, muscles tense, tail rigid. A low growl rolled from his throat. Jim set down his mug and listened. That's when he heard it, a faint tapping, slow and deliberate, like someone knocking from beneath the floorboards. Knock, knock, knock. Then silence. Jim froze. The sound was too distinct to be the wind. He grabbed the flashlight from the table, crouched beside the spot Rex was fixated on. The beam of light traced over the old floorboards, scratched, uneven, and dusty. Nothing moved. No rats, no holes, just wood. But Rex kept growling, teeth bared now. "Easy," Jim whispered, his voice low but steady. He pressed his palm against the floor, feeling the cold wood under his hand. For a moment, nothing. Then, ever so faintly, he thought he felt a vibration, like a heartbeat, coming from the earth below. His chest tightened. He pulled his hand back quickly and stared at the floor as the knocking came again, this time softer, almost rhythmic. The fire cracked loudly, making both of them flinch. The sound stopped. Silence filled the cabin once more, but the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, waiting. Rex slowly lay down, still watching the corner. Jim stayed awake long after midnight, listening. In the dim light, with the fire dying low, he realized that peace might not come easy in this place. The woods had their own stories, and maybe this cabin had been waiting for someone to listen. The next morning came gray and quiet. Mist hung between the trees like ghostly curtains, and the forest felt distant, as if holding its breath. Jim Walker woke in his chair, the fire long dead. Rex lay curled beside the cold hearth, his ears twitching in uneasy sleep. For a moment, Jim thought the night before had been nothing more than a trick of exhaustion. War veterans knew how the mind could play games when the silence got too loud. He stepped outside with his coffee, the ground wet from dew. The cabin looked smaller in daylight, almost harmless. Birds called from somewhere up in the pines, and for a brief second it felt normal. A man, his dog, and a quiet place in the woods. But when he looked down, he noticed the dirt beneath the porch had shifted slightly, as if something had been disturbed. He stared for a while, then turned away. "Probably raccoons," he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. That night, the knocking returned. At first it was faint, like rain hitting old wood. Then it grew louder, deliberate, slow. Knock, knock, knock. Rex was on his feet before Jim even moved, tail low, teeth bared. His growl rumbled deep in his chest. The sound came from the same corner near the fireplace, the same exact spot. Jim turned off the lantern and listened, heart thudding in his ears. The knocking stopped the instant he moved closer. He stayed awake until dawn. Every time he closed his eyes, the sound returned. Faint, rhythmic, as if someone were signaling from below. He'd served long enough to recognize patterns. In Afghanistan, he had once tracked an enemy by the cadence of their hammering underground. That same pulse echoed here, inside the floorboards of his new home. On the third night, Jim decided to end the guessing. He moved the furniture aside and sat near the spot with a flashlight, waiting. Rex stayed beside him, tense, ready. The fire burned low, shadows crawling across the walls. Midnight came and went. Silence. Then, at 12:37, the first knock, then another, then three in perfect rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. Rex barked sharply, claws scraping the floor. "Easy, boy," Jim whispered, though he was no longer sure if the words were meant for Rex or himself. He crouched low, pressing his ear to the wood. The knocks stopped, replaced by something else, a soft, dragging sound, like fingers or nails moving across the boards. His pulse quickened. "There's no way," he breathed. He slammed his palm against the floor and shouted, "Who's down there?" Silence. Then, faintly, something answered. Not words, not a voice, but a single dull thump, as if the ground itself exhaled. Rex barked again, louder this time, circling the spot. The dog's fur stood on end. Jim could feel the tension radiating from him. He grabbed a screwdriver and began prying at the floorboards. One edge came loose, splintering. Beneath the dust, he noticed long, thin scratches, as though someone, or something, had once tried to lift the boards from underneath. He froze, flashlight trembling in his grip. The scratches were human, no doubt about it. 5 parallel lines, evenly spaced, dug deep into the wood. Rex sniffed them and whimpered, backing away. Jim traced one with his finger and felt a jolt in his chest. It wasn't just fear. It was memory. He remembered the tunnels, the hidden bunkers overseas, the sounds of the enemy moving beneath the sand. The sense that death was never far, only waiting underfoot. The next day, Jim tried to distract himself. He repaired a broken fence, fetched water from the creek, cooked a simple meal. But no matter what he did, his eyes drifted toward that corner. Even Rex avoided it now, choosing to rest near the door instead. That night, Jim tried sleeping in the truck, but the forest outside was worse, the stillness louder than any noise. At 2 a.m., he swore he could hear it again, muffled even through the cabin walls. By dawn, he'd made up his mind. He fetched his crowbar and flashlight and returned inside. Dust motes floated in the first light as he knelt on the floor. "All right," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "Let's see what the hell you are." Rex stood nearby, trembling but loyal, eyes locked on the same spot. Jim wedged the crowbar under the loose plank and pushed. The board creaked but didn't give. He leaned harder. When it finally lifted, a rush of cold, damp air filled the room, like the breath of something long buried. Jim coughed, waving the dust away, and shined the flashlight into the dark opening. The beam vanished into blackness. He could just make out dirt, cobwebs, and the faint glint of something metallic below. Rex growled, deep and low. Jim hesitated at the edge of the hole, heart pounding in his throat. Whatever was down there had been waiting. He didn't know if it was danger or truth, maybe both. But as he stared into that darkness, one thought clawed at his mind. The war had followed him home. The morning after the knocking grew louder, Jim Walker stood in the middle of his cabin, staring at the patch of floor Rex had been fixated on for nights. The fire from the hearth had gone out, leaving only a faint curl of smoke. Dust danced lazily in the cold air as sunlight crept in through the cracked window panes. Rex stood beside him, tail stiff, ears perked, growling in short, uneasy bursts. Something down there was waiting. That much Jim could feel. He fetched his tools from the truck outside, a crowbar, an old screwdriver, and his Army-issued flashlight, the same one he'd carried through years of deployment. The wood groaned as he knelt down, tracing his hand over the floor. The scratches were clearer in daylight, long, deliberate, as though someone had tried to pry the boards up before him. Jim exhaled, steadying his breath. Then he slid the crowbar under the seam and pushed. The first board came loose with a sharp crack. The smell of damp earth rose instantly, thick and stale, like air trapped for decades. Rex barked once, then backed up, hackles raised. Jim lifted another plank, then another, until a square outline revealed itself, metal instead of wood, dull gray with patches of rust. He brushed away the dust, revealing the faint shape of a handle, recessed into the surface. It wasn't just a patch of flooring. It was a door. The hatch was no more than 3 feet wide, set flush with the cabin's foundation. A layer of grime had sealed it tight over the years. Jim tugged at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Rex growled again, circling, nose low to the ground. "Easy, boy," Jim murmured. But the dog's instincts didn't calm. If anything, he seemed more agitated, pacing back and forth, teeth flashing in the low light. It wasn't fear. It was recognition, like he'd caught a scent of something alive, something wrong. Jim leaned closer, running his hand over the metal. The coldness bit into his palm. And then he saw it, faint but still legible through the corrosion. Property of U.S. Army, 1964. He froze, his pulse slowed, his breath shallow. For a moment it felt as though time folded in on itself, the war, the noise, the faces of men he'd buried in his memory. 1964. That was Vietnam. That was where his nightmares came from. He sat back on his heels, staring at the inscription. The U.S. Army. What the hell would the Army be doing burying something beneath a cabin in the Oregon woods? He rubbed the back of his neck, the skin prickling. His mind began to assemble theories, a hidden supply cache, an old experiment, maybe something left behind from a training outpost. But the truth that whispered through his gut felt darker. He'd seen enough black ops work overseas to know the government didn't label things like this unless they were meant to stay hidden. Rex barked again, louder this time. Jim startled, his heart pounding. The dog's eyes were fixed on the hatch, body rigid, tail low. Soldier's stance. Jim felt the weight of his rifle above the fireplace, and, for a brief second, considered grabbing it, but instead he knelt down again, brushing more dirt away until his fingers traced something else carved into the metal near the hinge. Initials. JHL. The letters were uneven, as if scratched by hand with a knife or nail. Whoever did it wanted to be remembered. Jim frowned. He'd seen those initials before, or something like them. He thought back to an old Marine base outside Da Nang, where crates and weapons had been stamped with the same pattern. JHL. A supplier? A name? His mind raced through the fog of memory until it landed on a man, Lieutenant John H. Laird. Quiet, methodical, good at keeping secrets. He'd gone missing in '69. Official story, lost in combat. But everyone in Jim's unit knew he'd been assigned to something classified just before he disappeared. Now his stomach turned cold. Could this cabin, this goddamn $500 cabin, have belonged to Laird? Jim stood up, pacing the room. The floorboards creaked under his boots. Rex followed his every move, tense and ready. The thought of opening the hatch clawed at him. He wanted to know, needed to know, but the inscription had shifted everything. This wasn't just a mystery. It was a thread tied to a past he'd tried to bury. He took a long breath, walked to the window, and looked out at the tree line. The forest was still, utterly still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He turned back toward the hatch. "If you're trying to tell me something, Laird," he whispered, "you picked the wrong man." He knelt again, pressing the flashlight against the seam. The beam flickered, catching on flecks of metal and something else, faint dents around the lock. Bullet marks, maybe. Someone had tried to open it once. Someone desperate. He imagined Laird, years ago, down on this same floor, hands trembling, sweat dripping, trying to hide or protect whatever was inside. Jim's hand rested on the latch. It was rusted but still solid. He could force it open. It would take effort, maybe even damage the floor, but the curiosity gnawed at him like hunger. Then Rex barked again, sharp and low, almost a warning. The sound cut through the air, echoing off the cabin walls. Jim looked into the dog's eyes. They weren't just scared. They were pleading. Rex's instincts had saved him more than once overseas. Jim trusted that more than any logic. So he stopped. Just sat there, in the dim light of late afternoon, his hand hovering above the metal. He didn't open the hatch that day. Instead, he dragged the loose floorboards back over it and leaned against the wall, the flashlight still in his hand. Rex finally calmed, curling beside him, but never taking his eyes off the spot. The rhythmic knocking didn't come that night, but the silence felt heavier, like whatever lay beneath was listening, waiting for him to try again. The rain came in the early afternoon, thin and cold, dripping from the eaves of the old cabin like the forest itself was whispering. Jim Walker sat at the small table by the window, running a rag across his rifle. It wasn't out of need, it was habit, the kind that came from too many years of cleaning weapons in silence. Rex lay near the door, half asleep but twitching every time thunder rolled across the valley. The hatch beneath the floor remained untouched, covered once more with its boards. Yet the thought of it pressed on Jim's mind like a weight that refused to lift. He decided to keep busy. The storm had trapped him inside, and he figured it was as good a time as any to start clearing the clutter left behind by the last owner. Most of the furniture looked older than the Vietnam era itself. Handmade shelves, warped paintings, dust layered thick enough to write on. He moved a crooked landscape painting off the wall, intending to toss it aside, when something behind it caught his eye. A faint, rectangular outline, slightly darker than the rest of the wall. Jim tapped the wood once. Hollow. He frowned, set the painting down, and pried his fingers into the edge. A small panel came loose, and behind it, wrapped in old fabric, was a book. No, a journal, its leather cover cracked and water-stained, the pages yellowed and brittle. The name was written on the first page in faded ink: Sergeant Daniel Hurst, U.S. Marine Corps. Jim stared at the handwriting, his chest tightening. The date beneath it read 1973. He carried the journal to the table and sat down. The smell of mildew and smoke clung to the paper as he opened it. The first entries were simple, details of hunting trips, weather notes, supply lists. But as the pages turned, the tone changed. The writing became restless, erratic. The pen strokes pressed deep into the paper. "Dreams again," one entry said. "The tunnels, the noise, can't sleep." Another: "Rex doesn't like it here, keeps pacing at night. Maybe he hears it too." Jim paused at that line. Rex, the name matched his dog's. He looked down at his companion lying near the fireplace, now wide awake, watching him. "Another Rex, huh?" Jim muttered under his breath. The coincidence gnawed at him. He kept reading. The entries began to align with what he'd been experiencing himself. Scratching under the floor, knocking sounds, restless nights. Daniel Hurst had described them in chilling detail. 3 knocks, always the same spot, near the hearth, like someone trying to get out. Jim rubbed his temples. He wasn't the first to hear it. Further along, the handwriting grew slanted, hurried. The ink smudged, as if written in panic. "I thought it was rats, but it's not. There's metal under the boards, a door, locked tight. U.S. Army markings, 1964, my year, my curse." Jim's heart pounded. He flipped to the next page, then the next, scanning for more. "Opened it tonight, shouldn't have. Smelled the jungle again, the rot, the silence before the ambush. Heard something breathing down there. Rex won't stop barking. I closed it, but it's not enough." The last page was torn, but 3 lines remained, scrawled and shaky. "The noise started again. Rex keeps barking. Something's moving below. I shouldn't have opened it." Then nothing. The rest of the pages were blank. Jim leaned back in his chair, staring at the faded words as thunder rolled once more outside. His breath came shallow, and for the first time in years, the silence around him felt alive. The journal lay open, trembling under the draft seeping through the cabin walls. He could almost hear the sound Daniel Hurst described, the faint, rhythmic tapping. Rex stood suddenly, ears up, a low growl rumbling from his chest. The dog's gaze locked on the same corner near the fireplace. The hair on Jim's neck bristled. "No," he whispered, "not again." But the sound was there, subtle, distant, unmistakable. "Knock, knock, knock." He grabbed the flashlight, flicking it on. "Stay," he told Rex, though his voice carried no conviction. He knelt near the fireplace, listening. The noise had stopped, as if it knew he was there. He touched the boards, the same ones he'd replaced over the hatch. They felt colder than the air around them. "Daniel Hurst," Jim murmured. The name felt strange on his tongue, heavy with history. What had that man seen? What had he brought back from the war that was still trapped under this floor? He thought of the inscription on the hatch, the initials JHL, the Army mark from '64. The pieces were starting to align in a way that made his stomach turn. Lightning flashed through the window. For an instant, the cabin was bathed in white light. And in that instant, Jim thought he saw movement, not from beneath the floor, but behind him. A flicker, a shadow. He spun, but there was nothing there. Just Rex, barking wildly, teeth bared toward the hatch. Jim grabbed the journal and held it tight against his chest. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. The entries weren't just warnings, they were confessions. The man who'd written them hadn't vanished. He'd gone mad. And now, Jim feared, The same thing was happening to him. He sat there until the fire burned low, the journal open on his lap, Rex lying tense beside him. Outside, the rain turned to fog, swallowing the forest in silence. Every now and then, Jim thought he heard something beneath him. Faint, scraping, like the whisper of a shovel dragging through soil. But he told himself it was only the storm, only the wind. And yet when he finally closed the journal and set it aside, he noticed something written faintly on the back cover, too light to see at first glance. He held it under the flashlight. The words were barely legible, etched in the leather as though by fingernail. "If you find this, don't open the hatch again." Jim looked down at Rex, whose eyes glimmered in the firelight. The dog let out a soft, trembling whine. For the first time since buying the cabin, Jim Walker wished he'd never come here. The rain didn't stop that night. It drummed endlessly on the tin roof of the cabin, a low, steady rhythm that matched the thoughts running through Jim Walker's mind. The yellow flame of the kerosene lamp flickered on the table, casting long shadows across his face. The journal of Sergeant Daniel Hurst lay open before him, the last scrawled lines etched deep into his memory. Something's moving below. Each time he read it, he could almost feel his own heartbeat sinking with that faint tapping beneath the floorboards. Rex barked again, sharp, anxious, insistent. His fur bristled, ears pinned forward, eyes fixed on the same corner of the room, the same spot where the scratches on the floor told a silent story. Jim rose slowly, hand gripping his flashlight. He wasn't sure what he was looking for anymore. An answer? A ghost? Or maybe just the end of his own curiosity. But after all those years in the Marines, fear was no longer something that stopped him. It only told him where to go next. He dragged an old crowbar and a small hammer from the shed outside. The wood groaned as he pried it loose plank by plank, every strike echoing like thunder in the tiny cabin. Dust filled the air, and the musty smell of decay rose up from below. Then the last board came free, and his flashlight caught the dull reflection of metal. A hatch, iron, cold, and sealed tight. Jim knelt, brushing away decades of dirt and cobwebs. There, faintly visible through the rust, were a few engraved words. Property of U.S. Army, 1964. His breath hitched. For a moment he wasn't in Oregon anymore. He was back in the jungle, hearing the static hiss of a radio, the pop of distant gunfire, the low hum of generators in makeshift bunkers. The ghosts of his past seemed to lean closer, whispering through the cracks in the floor. Rex stepped forward, growling low in his throat. Jim placed a hand on the dog's head, feeling the muscles tense beneath his fingers. "It's okay, boy," he murmured. But Rex didn't relax. His gaze stayed fixed on the hatch, unblinking, like he was seeing something Jim couldn't. It was more than unease. It was instinct, the kind that had saved them both more than once. Jim lifted the crowbar again, wedging it beneath the lock. The sound of metal scraping against metal filled the cabin, merging with the storm outside. Every hit seemed to echo through his bones, pulling old memories from where he'd buried them. With a final crack, the rusted lock snapped free. The air that escaped was thick, heavy, and wrong, as if sealed away for half a century. A rush of cold air spilled up from the darkness below. It smelled of iron and damp earth. Jim aimed his flashlight downward, revealing a narrow iron staircase disappearing into the black. His throat tightened, but he took the first step. The stairs creaked beneath his boots, each footfall swallowed by the silence. Rex followed reluctantly, his nails clinking softly on the metal. Steps. At the bottom, the air was colder. The small chamber barely had room for a man to stand upright. Concrete walls, water-stained and pitted, surrounded them. On one side stood a foldable metal table with a dusty radio, old military issue, its knobs frozen in place. A few ammo crates leaned against the wall, their stenciled labels long faded. Rex sniffed the air, then growled again, backing away from the table. Jim swept his light across the room. The beam stopped on a large green army trunk tucked into the corner. The paint was peeling, but the name was still legible. Hurst D. His stomach dropped. Sergeant Daniel Hurst, the same name from the journal, the same man who'd written about the noise, the same man who had lived, and possibly died, in this cabin. He stepped closer, brushing dust from the lid. The trunk was sealed with layers of wire and wax, as if someone had wanted to make sure it stayed shut. Rex barked sharply, pulling at Jim's sleeve with his teeth. "Easy, Rex," Jim said, voice barely more than a whisper. But even as he spoke, he knew the dog was right. Something in his gut screamed at him to stop. Still, he didn't. He'd spent years running from the war, from the weight of things left undone. Now the war had found him again, buried beneath his own floor. His fingers closed around the crowbar one more time. The trunk waited in the dim light, silent and patient. And as he knelt before it, Jim Walker realized that some doors, once opened, would never close again. The hinges of the old army chest shrieked as Jim pried it open. Rust flaked away like dried blood, falling to the concrete floor below. The smell hit him first, stale, metallic, and damp, like something that hadn't breathed in decades. Rex growled low, his body tense, tail stiff, eyes locked on the opening as if he already knew what was waiting inside. Inside, the beam of Jim's flashlight trembled across the contents. It wasn't weapons or relics, not the treasure trove of some forgotten soldier. Instead, wrapped tightly in a rotting military blanket, was the unmistakable shape of human remains. Bones, brittle and yellowed, clung to scraps of uniform. The faded name tag, half torn but still legible, read Hurst. Jim froze. The same name from the journal upstairs, Sergeant Daniel Hurst. For a long moment, the silence in the room was unbearable. The only sound was the slow drip of water from the ceiling and the pounding of Jim's own heart. He crouched beside the open chest, his breath fogging in the cold air. The reality of it all began to sink in. Hurst hadn't just disappeared. He had died here, entombed beneath the cabin he built to escape the war. Rex began pacing in circles, whining and growling under his breath, his ears pinned back as he sniffed the air, occasionally darting glances toward the dark corners of the room. Jim could feel it too, a heavy, suffocating presence that seemed to linger in the shadows, pressing against his chest. It wasn't just fear. It was something else, something that didn't want to be disturbed. He lifted the flashlight toward the wall behind the chest, and that's when he saw it. Faint at first, then clearer as the light caught the uneven surface, words scrawled in a frantic hand, etched into the concrete with what looked like the edge of a knife. He never left the war. Jim swallowed hard. The words echoed in his mind, twisting into the still air. Whoever, or whatever, Hurst had become down here, he hadn't escaped the battlefield. Maybe the war had followed him home, crawling into his head until there was no more line between Oregon and Vietnam. Jim felt the sting of memory. Gunfire, sand, blood, the faces of men he couldn't save. He knew that kind of haunting. He reached into the chest, gently brushing dirt off the remains. A fragment of a dog tag dangled from the skeleton's neck. Jim held it up to the light. Sergeant Daniel Hurst, U.S. Marine Corps. He whispered the name out loud, as if speaking it might offer some kind of peace. But Rex barked sharply, snapping Jim back to the moment. The dog's eyes were fixed on something in the far corner of the bunker, a patch of wall darker than the rest. Jim turned his flashlight toward it. For a second, he thought he saw movement, the faint impression of a man's outline. There one heartbeat, gone the next. The air grew colder. His breath came out in visible clouds now. The weight of the room pressed closer, as though the concrete itself remembered everything that had happened here. "Easy, boy," Jim murmured, his voice low. He reached for Rex's collar, but the dog refused to move, muscles rigid, teeth bared. The German shepherd's hackles stood on end as a faint metallic tapping echoed from somewhere behind the wall, a sound just like the one from under the cabin floor. Jim's pulse quickened. That same rhythm, the same knocks that had started all of this. The flashlight flickered once, then steadied. Jim took a step back toward the ladder, his instincts screaming to get out. But before he turned, his eyes caught one last thing. A small framed photograph half buried in dust beside the chest. He picked it up. It showed a young Marine standing next to his German shepherd, both smiling in their uniforms. The name scrawled on the back made Jim's blood run cold. Hurst and Rex, 1965. He stared down at his own dog. Rex's ears were perked, his body trembling. The coincidence was too precise, too deliberate. The same name, the same breed. It wasn't possible. Jim felt something shift deep inside, a cold certainty that none of this was random. Maybe his Rex hadn't just found the cabin. Maybe the cabin had called them here. Jim closed the chest slowly, his hand shaking. He backed toward the stairs, keeping his light trained on the wall where the words glowed faintly in the dust. He never left the war. The sound of his boots on concrete echoed through the hollow space, each step harder than the last. Rex didn't take his eyes off the dark corner until they were back at the hatch. As Jim climbed out of the hole and sealed the hatch shut, the cabin seemed to sigh, the wood settling, the storm outside picking up again. He leaned against the wall, breathing hard, the cold of the underground still clinging to him. Rex pressed against his leg, whining softly, his tail low. Jim looked toward the floor one last time. Somewhere beneath them, something tapped, 3 soft knocks, then silence. The dawn broke gray and quiet over the Oregon forest. A thin veil of fog drifted between the trees, and the cabin sat in stillness, its roof wet with the night's rain. Jim Walker stood by the old metal hatch one last time, the air cold enough to sting his breath. Beside him, Rex waited, ears lowered, as if he understood what was about to happen. They had both seen enough of ghosts, the kind that wore uniforms and carried their silence into the ground. Jim spent the morning digging beneath a cedar tree at the edge of the clearing. The soil was damp, heavy, and reluctant to give way. His shovel struck rock, roots, and once, the corner of an old shell casing that must have been there for decades. By the time the sun began to climb through the mist, his hands were blistered and raw, but he didn't stop. He wasn't burying just bones. He was laying to rest something older, something that had haunted both the cabin and himself. When the grave was ready, Jim carried the remains wrapped in the army blanket, his movements slow and deliberate. The weight felt wrong, too light to be human, yet heavy in ways no scale could measure. He laid the bundle down gently in the earth, then placed the faded dog tag on top, the metal glinting dully in the pale light. Rex sat beside him, perfectly still, his dark eyes following every motion. There was no barking, no growling, just a calm stillness that hung in the cold morning air. Jim knelt in silence for a long while. He didn't pray, he hadn't done that in years. But he did speak, softly, barely above a whisper. "You're home now, Sergeant," he said, His voice cracked halfway through. "You can rest." Then he took Hurst's old insignia, the Marine Corps emblem still faintly visible through rust and grime, and pressed it into the soil above the grave. It looked right there, as if it had been waiting all this time to return. The forest seemed to breathe differently after that. The mist lifted slightly, and a faint breeze rustled through the trees. Rex tilted his head, ears twitching, then lay down beside the mound, letting out a slow, deep sigh. For the first time since they'd arrived, the woods were silent. No knocking beneath the floorboards, no whispering in the dark, no invisible eyes watching from the corners. Just the sound of wind and water, and the heartbeat of a place finally at peace. That night, Jim built a small fire outside the cabin. He didn't go back inside, not yet. He and Rex sat by the flames, watching sparks drift up into the cold air. The cabin stood behind them like a shadow, its windows glowing faintly with the reflection of firelight. Jim took a sip of black coffee from his tin cup and ran a hand through Rex's fur. "We did what we came for," he said quietly. Rex rested his head on Jim's knee, eyes half closed. There was no tension in the dog's body anymore, no low growl in his chest. Just calm. When Jim finally looked back towards the cabin, something in the window caught his eye. The fog had thickened again, curling softly around the porch and eaves. Through it, he could make out a faint silhouette. The shape of a man in uniform, standing by the window, motionless. The brim of a military cap caught the moonlight. Jim froze, his breath caught halfway between fear and recognition. The figure raised a hand slowly, palm flat, 2 fingers pressed together. A formal salute. For a moment, Jim could only stare. Then instinct took over. He stood, straightened his back, and returned the salute. His movements were sharp, precise, the kind learned through years of repetition. The figure by the window didn't move again. It simply stood there, dissolving gently into the mist as the morning light began to grow behind it. When the fog cleared, the window was empty. Jim exhaled, long and slow. There was no fear now, only a deep, quiet ache that felt almost like relief. He turned toward Rex, who was watching him calmly, tail thumping once against the ground. "Let's go, partner," Jim said. "Time to move on." He gathered his pack, slung his rifle across his shoulder, and gave the cabin one last look. The wood was dark, the roof bowed, but somehow it looked different now. Not haunted, just old, just a place that had finally remembered how to sleep. As they walked down the muddy trail towards the main road, the forest swallowed them in mist. Jim could feel the cold lifting from his bones, replaced by something lighter. The morning sun broke through the trees in fractured beams, painting Rex's fur gold. For the first time in years, Jim felt that strange, impossible thing. Peace. True peace, the kind he had once thought no soldier ever really found. Behind him, the cabin stood silent among the trees, holding its secrets and its dead quietly beneath the floor.